Alright, our next object has two additional complications. It has a rougher texture. It's also not pure white. It has a slightly darker value on it. So let's deal with those two extra complications. Let's sketch in our object. Let's measure the width to the height. In this case, I noticed that the width of the object exceeds the height by a touch. So we're going to draw a rectangle that looks like this. Let's sketch in our shape. And then let's go around the object with a little bit of contour. So in this case, our object has a little bit of roughness to it. I'm going to indicate that in the contour. We're ready to shade. So we need three things. We need to indicate the shape of the light break, which, even though the object is round, is fairly complicated. So generally it's going to go across like this. But it's going to run this way, run up this way, run up this way, go across, and run like this. Now, one thing to keep in mind, our object has a bumpy texture to it, so our light break, technically speaking, really should be doing something that looks like this. When you have an object with a rough texture, in that case, simplify the light break. It helps to blur your eyes a little bit and just get the general shape. So I'm ignoring the roughness and just pretending as if the object is perfectly smooth. Okay. Now let's indicate our highlight and also the shape of our cast shadow, which runs like this. Again, you can figure out where it goes behind the object, about at the midpoint. I can check the length of it. It's about half the distance across. This needs to curve in a little bit, be a little bit rounder. Okay, we're ready to shade. First step, separate our highlight from the light. Because our object is off-white, I need to go a little bit darker. So I'm going to start off by separating the highlight from the light and getting what's called the local value of the object. The fact that the object is not white, it's off-white. So we're going to shade this a little bit darker than I initially shaded the apple, down to what I see is the lightest light. This is always the first step when you're shading an object that's not white. You separate the highlight from the light by shading down to the brightest local value. So if the object is mid-tone gray, I'm going to shade a lot darker. But you can see that I'm shading considerably darker than the initial value that I have right here. So once again, if the object is off-white, gray, or really dark, separate the highlight from the light by shading the object down to the local value. Okay. Next, I'm going to bounce directly into my body shadow. Again, treat the shape of the body shadow as if the object had no bumps at all. Whenever you have a textured object, at the beginning, ignore the texture. Ignore the texture. Keep the light break complex. Don't simplify it. So don't take something that's kind of zigzaggy and snake-like and turn it into a simple sphere. That would be a mistake. However, a certain degree of simplification is important. I need to get the shape to look round before I apply texture. So once again, anytime you have a textured object, make it round first, then apply the texture. This is a little bit the way computer rendering works. Somebody who's rendering, let's say, some kind of monster, will first render the shape of the monster, and then layer on whatever the skin texture is. So it could be fish scales, or rhinoceros skin, a bunch of cracks, oozing scabs, whatever it is. Focus on the form, then get the texture. If you try to get the texture first, it's going to overwhelm the form. It's going to make your forms appear really flat. Okay, also, do not forget to shade the cast shadow at the same time. Keep the shadow edge where the cast shadow starts really sharp. And then don't forget to fuzz it out as it moves away. Alright, let's bounce to a darker pencil. So I already started off with a 2B, but now let's switch to our 4B. Where's my 4B pencil? Here it is. Let's start working to get the general shadow value darker and start building the core shadow. Okay, the core shadow is where you actually start getting specific about the texture. So if the object was smooth, the core shadow would be fuzzy but smooth. However, our core shadow now is running across a bunch of really bumpy textures. Right? The core shadow is going to reflect the texture a lot. So I'm going to make the core shadow much more textured, like this. And you can see once I've put in that kind of bumpy looking core shadow, our object is going to start looking a little bit rougher. Okay. Don't forget to bounce back and forth. I'm going to start going a little bit darker in the cast shadow. By putting in the cast shadow, it allows us to see the reflected light more clearly. It allows us to gauge and compare our values one against the other. Again, value is very relative. I don't know what one value is until I can compare it to something else. Build up the values little by little. Be patient. Be very, very patient. Over time, as you guys get better, you'll speed up. Maybe. Possibly. However, right now, I want you guys to go very slowly. Don't smear your drawing. Don't use your thumbs. I'll be able to tell, by the way, if you did it. I will catch you. Let the values build up. Alright, so let's start going even darker. And probably at this stage, I'm going to bounce into the lighter areas and start getting my halftones. So here's the highlight. Here's the lightest light. Let's start going a little bit darker this way. So here's our halftone here. And then we start seeing halftones that are created by the texture. So these little areas right here, like this. I notice that it's going a little bit darker here. This. It's going a little bit darker here. Like this. As you put in your halftones, you realize that the shadow probably doesn't go dark enough. We need to do that in order to get the shadows right. So notice, I'm dealing with halftone right now. In a general way, I'm not picking out texture yet. Okay, so now we have halftone. Let's go into our shadows again and make them the appropriate degree of darkness. Because our object is generally darker than the white apple, the shadows are going to be darker as well. This is particularly important when you have a number of objects in your composition. One that's white, one that goes a little bit darker. Don't treat all your objects as if they're the same value, if they're not. Okay, so this is my 4B. I've exhausted the darks in my 4B. Time for 6B. Okay, I'm putting in my core shadow. I'm going to make the core shadow a little bit bumpier looking. Let's start going really dark in our cast shadow. Here. And then really, really dark where the object is touching the stand. object just disappeared from my screen. Okay. Okay, so once the object looks more or less three-dimensional, I'm going to go into the lights and put in my texture. Here's a really important principle. Texture is going to be stronger where it's closer to your eyeball. And then, as the object starts wrapping around and moving back, you want to make the texture a little bit softer. Right? So here, I'm going to start putting in those little bumps. Here, 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 and here. As I go this way, I need to make sure the bumps get a little bit lighter. Okay? Do not put strong textures at the edges of the form. It'll flatten your object. Okay? So, particularly in the shadows, the texture is going to be really soft. Right? There's less light there. In halftones, the texture might be a little more visible because the light is raking across the form and picking out the lights and the darks with a little bit more effect, a little bit stronger. But generally speaking, keep the texture strongest here, and going this way, this way, this way, this way, make it a little bit softer. Okay, this probably should use a little bit more contrast. Again, it's hard to achieve really strong contrast with graphite without a few hours of work, which I'm not going to bore you with. I don't have time-lapse on this camera. I should get it. Okay, but I think I'll conclude the demo at this point. In the next demonstration, we're going to deal with an object that's slightly reflective. So, stay tuned.